let me, first of all, let me thank Dorothy Wong and the East Asia Center for bringing together such wonderful people and organizing a wonderful conference. I'm also actually very grateful to Dorothy for coming up with the title for this conference. I very much like the idea of complementary and competing visions. It reminds me of one of my favorite films, a Japanese film by the name of Rashomon, which is a film about a crime is told by, I think it's 7 different people. And each version of the crime adds a dimension, a new layer of meaning. And I think you can really only understand the true meaning of that crime by combining all of the different views or visions of that crime. It also reminds me of Graham Allison. And so I'm thinking not so much of the Thucydides trap, but I'm thinking of a much better book, The Essence of Decision, where Graham Allison noted where you stand depends on where you sit. And I think this is also very important in considering the different perspectives that, well, at least certainly the perspective that I'm going to present, and I think many of the different perspectives. That is, where people are coming from really does affect how they understand things. Having said that, then I feel obliged to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. In the short answer to that question is Mumbai. So I just got back from Mumbai earlier this week, and not only that, so I may be somewhat slightly less detached from the Indian perspective than what I might otherwise be. But the other aspect that is important for you to know is what I was doing in Mumbai. I actually was hired to do a study of bankruptcy. So if I see debt in places that you don't, you'll know why, okay? All right, so let me then move and tell you what I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to begin just elaborating India's critique of the BRI. And then I'm going to sort of test that critique by looking at 2, you might say, case studies. So one is the experience of Sri Lanka with the BRI. The other is the experience of Pakistan with the BRI. Then from there, I'm going to look at, draw some conclusions. One of the things I'm going to look at is, are there potential alternatives to the BRI coming from other countries such as India, but not only India? And then I'm going to consider what we can learn from actually studying the BRI, because I actually think the BRI throws up a rich set of possible research questions that we could think about. Okay, so let me move here. All right. In May 2017, China organized a summit on the BRI in Beijing. The summit was attended by 29 heads of state, and many other countries, including the United States, sent delegations to the summit. India sent no one. The immediate reason for India's boycotting of the BRI was that under the BRI, and in particular the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, there was joint construction between the Pakistanis and the Chinese in the disputed territory of Kashmir that India claimed for its own. So it claimed sovereign control over this particular territory. In India was particularly exercised to protest the violation of what it considered to be its sovereignty. In addition, an official government of India statement that was issued before the summit declared connectivity initiatives must be based on universally recognized international norms, good governance, rule of law, openness, transparency, and equality, and that they must also follow the principles of financial responsibility to avoid projects that would create unsustainable debt burden. So this idea of the BRI promoting unsustainable debt burden, in fact, in a very sort of strategic way, is widespread amongst certainly the Indian press. And so I pulled up this cartoon from the influential Economic Times, you might say sort of the Wall Street Journal of the Indian press, that sort of highlights that. All right. It's important to remember that India was not alone in expressing these concerns. The European Union refused to support the summit's BRI related trade statement. It criticized the BRI, saying that it did not include commitments to transparency and social and environmental sustainability. Somewhat later, was earlier alluded to, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson called China a new imperialist power reminiscent of European colonialism. The International Monetary Fund warned that Chinese loans are promoting unsustainable debt burdens. Now, before I go on, I want to say two things. One is that the view of the official Indian government was disputed in the Indian press. The idea that India should boycott the BRI was a somewhat controversial position that was opposed by many who felt that India was losing out on many opportunities, and that also felt that if India felt strongly about the lack of transparency and the need to improve the governance of the BRI, that they should in fact get involved in the BRI and influence it from within. So there was a lively debate about these positions, but it's the case that the current government, which is a much more sort of nationalist government, basically, decided to take a much more strident position than what other people had said. Also, just following up on the idea of where you stand depends on where you sit, it's important to remember that India's position was influenced by a number of, I think, really vital factors. First of all, there's no doubt that the BRI poses a security threat to India, right? You have to remember two things. One is that India is the, I think I would call it, hegemonic power in South Asia. And it reminds me, it considers South Asia to be its backyard. And as I can attest, as a, you might say, an academic with a backyard, sometimes the backyards of academics go untended and unappreciated. And in fact, I think that's the case for India in its backyard, that in fact it had neglected and not really cultivated positive relations with many of its neighbors. Also, India considers the Indian Ocean to be its own, you might say, private pool, or it has, and certainly the BRI has brought a growing Chinese presence into the Indian Ocean. In fact, so much so that India has raised the concern that China is creating a string of pearls with which it will pull and ultimately strangle India. So let me just sort of show you a little bit about why we might think about this as a string of pearls, or at least why the Indians might. So I already talked about China helping to develop a harbor in Myanmar. They also are helping to develop a deep water harbor in Chittagong in Bangladesh. We'll talk a little bit more about the harbor that they built in Sri Lanka. In the Maldives, China owns more than half of the debt of the Maldives, and they have acquired at relatively cheap rates at least two islets from the Maldives archipelago. Then we can move up to Gwadar in Pakistan. All of these ocean ports are being developed, and they have the potential to host, if they haven't hosted already, Chinese naval deployments. And then we could go over to, if we had the map here, we could go over to Africa, Djibouti, which is China's first overseas military base. All right. So you could see from an Indian perspective how they're moving from an area where India considered that it had with the possible exception of the United States, where India considered to basically sort of have monopoly control over the Indian Ocean, to a situation where China's presence is looming and intimidating. All right, so there's another important aspect of the threat that India feels, and that is that the BRI is not only about physical infrastructure, but in fact also there's the digital Silk Road. While the BRI can be viewed as also a vehicle for spreading Chinese influence through its high technologies. So we could talk about artificial intelligence. We could talk about China's great advances in terms of 5G. We could talk about also satellite navigation systems as being elements of new high technologies. And I remember that, in fact, India itself sort of has at least pretensions and aspirations in this high-tech field. So the fact that along with the BRI, there is the digital Silk Road is also threatening to India. So let's then examine the Indian sort of understanding by looking at two cases. So first we'll look at the case of Sri Lanka, then we'll look at the case of Pakistan. So let's go here. Okay, so I'm going to, in particular, spend time talking about Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. All right, the construction of Hambantota Port was a favorite project of the former Sri Lankan president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, whose home and parliamentary constituency is located in the Hambantota district. From the beginning, there were questions about whether a port in the rural district of Hambantota would ever be commercially viable, given that the small island of Sri Lanka has a population of just 22 million. And it already had a thriving port in Colombo, which had plenty of room for expansion. Furthermore, if in fact there were need for a second port, there was the availability of Trincomalee, which has the 5th largest natural harbor in the world. So there clearly were viable alternatives to Hambantota. Chinese officials well, let me go back and say Rajapaksa, who was elected to be president of Sri Lanka in 2005, presided over the last 4 years of Sri Lanka's civil war, during which the government's human rights record was widely condemned in the West, and Sri Lanka was increasingly marginalized by Western nations. During this period, from 2005 until the resolution of the civil war in 2009, Rajapaksa and Sri Lanka increasingly turned towards China, a country with which Sri Lanka had long had good relations. Chinese officials contend that China's interest in Hambantota is purely economic, but Sri Lankan officials have stated that the port's intelligence and strategic potential were of interest to the Chinese from the very beginnings of the negotiations. A former Sri Lankan foreign secretary and ambassador to China told the New York Times that sharing intelligence was an essential, if secret, part of the deal. Suspicions that China saw Hambantota more as a strategic than a commercial asset were reinforced when Chinese submarines docked at the port beginning in 2014. Initially, the terms of finance were moderate, but they came with growing requirements, or they came with the requirement that Sri Lanka hire the China Harbor Engineering Company to execute the project. Later, China ratcheted up the terms of finance as Sri Lanka attempted to renegotiate the payment schedule and add more financing. The port was initially opened on Rajapaksa's birthday in 2010, even though a huge boulder blocked the entrance to the harbor until 2012. despite that Hambantota was operating well below capacity, Rajapaksa asked the Chinese for loans to expand the port. The Chinese were only too happy to comply. The plight of Hambantota became an issue in the 2015 elections as the public became suspicious of Rajapaksa's authoritarian tendencies. At his height, the president and his three brothers controlled ministries whose budgets accounted for 80% of all government spending, as well as his cozy relationship with the Chinese. The Chinese found that President Rajapaksa was a valuable ally, and they found ways to bolster his position in Sri Lankan politics. During the 2015 elections, the Chinese ambassador openly lobbied for Rajapaksa, and the Chinese harbor engineering company made illicit payments of at least $7.6 million to Rajapaksa's political campaign, according to documents and checks collected by a government investigation, is reported by the New York Times. Though Rajapaksa lost the elections in 2015, Sri Lanka had already become mired in debt. And the new government, though it was eager to balance China with close relations to the United States and India, continued to take loans from China. By December 2017, the government of Sri Lanka was forced to trade 85% of the equity in the port of Hambantota to the China Merchants Port in return for writing down $1.25 billion in debt. As part of the deal, it was also obliged to grant the China merchants ownership of 15,000 acres of land around which to build an industrial zone. Having gained a controlling interest in the Hambantota port, the Chinese continued to attempt to influence Sri Lankan politics. In November 2018, the previously anti-China president, Maithripala Sirisena, dismissed his prime minister for alleged misconduct. He called for new elections in January, but in an amazing reversal, he appointed Mahinda Rajapaksa as his new prime minister. So Rajapaksa was Sirisena's sort of arch rival, and it was incredible to most people that he should appoint Rajapaksa as his prime minister. Rajapaksa, despite the controversy, immediately tweeted a picture showing him warmly greeting China's ambassador to Sri Lanka and stating that he had received congratulatory wishes from Chinese President Xi Jinping. Influential Indian strategist Brahma Chelani has colorfully declared that Hambantota is an example of what he calls creditor imperialism. Chelani accuses China of a predatory approach in which it uses, quote, sovereign debt to bend other states to its will without having to fire a single shot, because China chooses its projects according to, as he says, their long-term strategic value. They may yield short-term returns that are insufficient for countries to repay their debts. This gives China added leverage, he goes on to say, which it can use to force borrowers to swap debt for equity, thereby expanding China's global footprint by trapping a growing number of countries in debt servitude. Chelani provocatively likens China's approach to European actions during the Opium Wars. He even notes the parallel of the British 99-year lease of Hong Kong to the 99-year lease of Hambantota. Chelani writes, these experiences should serve as a warning that Belt and Road is essentially an imperial project. States caught in debt bondage to China risk losing both their most valuable natural assets and their very sovereignty. All right, let me turn now to Pakistan. So I'm behind in my slides here. Okay, so notice the dot here is, this is Hambantota, here's Colombo, Trincomalee is this big bay right here, and this is actually is, I think I tried to show before, sort of a very rural area with very little settlement around it. Let's go to the China-Pakistan economic corridor now. The Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor makes Pakistan the recipient of more BRI investment, $62 billion, than any of the other countries involved in the BRI. The CPEC involves investment in transportation and communication infrastructure extending from Kashgar, so up here, Kashgar, all the way down to Karachi and to the relatively newly constructed port of Gwadar, right? You'll notice that we're talking about both rail links, highway links, extending. Now, this red area here is the more economically developed area, primarily of the state Punjab, also to some extent of the Sindh down here. But there are also links that go through the west, and this is, in particular, this area here is Baluchistan, which is lightly populated, but an area with great natural resources, which will be significant in a second. So Gwadar Port down here is actually, in a sense, the linchpin of the CPEC. It is being managed by the China Overseas Port Holding Company. The COPHC was awarded a $1.02 billion worth of contracts for expanding and upgrading the port. These plans include upgrading of the docking for larger ships with a deadweight tonnage of about 70,000 tons. Building also a $130 million breakwater around the port, constructing a floating liquid nitrogen gas facility that will have the capacity of 500 million cubic feet of liquefied natural gas per day, and it will be connected to the Gwadar Nawab Shah segment of the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline. The port is next to a 2,282-acre free trade zone in Gwadar, which is being modeled along the lines of China's special economic zone. Control over the land was transferred to the China Overseas Port Holding Company in November 2015 as part of a 43-year lease. The site will include manufacturing zones, logistics hubs, warehouses, and display centers. The CPOHC is reported to have plans to invest some $4.5 billion in infrastructure into the area. Businesses located in the zone would be exempt from customs authorities as well as many provincial and federal taxes. Businesses established in the special economic zone will be exempt from Pakistani income, sales, and federal excise taxes for 23 years. Contractors and subcontractors associated with the China Overseas Port Holding Company will be exempted from such taxes for 20 years, while a 40-year tax holiday will be granted for imports of equipment, materials, plant and machinery, appliances, accessories that are to be for construction of Gwadar Port and the Special Economic Zone. Pakistani officials predict that the CPEC will result in the creation of upwards of 2.3 million jobs. No small figure in a society like Pakistan where there's a real shortage of jobs. This just between 2015 and 2030. And it should add between 2 and 2.5 percentage points of annual economic growth. On June 21st, 2017, Dawn, Pakistan's largest circulation English language newspaper, published an expose of the long-term plan on China-Pakistan economic corridor. This was written by China's National Development and Reforms Commission and the China Development Bank in December 2015. The plan projected that the Chinese state-owned agricultural companies would lease thousands of acres of land for production to be exported to China. The plan detailed the Xinjiang production and construction corps would introduce new technologies to increase productivity of Pakistani agriculture and livestock breeding in order to increase exports to China. It envisioned that the Pakistani textile industry would increase its exports of yarn, coarse cloth, and other inputs to textile manufacturers in Xinjiang. The plan surmised, quote, China can make the most of the Pakistani market in cheap raw materials to develop the textiles and garments industry and help soak up surplus labor forces from Kashgar. At the same time, the plan saw the CPEC as opening up Pakistan for China's manufacturing exports. The plan called for the formulation of a policy environment and the construction of infrastructure to facilitate the entry of Chinese manufacturing companies, household appliances, telecommunications, fertilizer, cement, and building materials, and mining. It stated that Chinese companies would receive preferential treatment with regards to land, tax, logistics, and services, and special incentives with regards to the reduction of rates for the enterprise income tax, tariffs, and sales tax. In effect, the CPEC seems to make Pakistan into a supplier of raw materials to China and a market for Chinese manufacturers and surplus labor. The CPEC is also designed to export China's surveillance state technology. Noting that Pakistan's security situation is deteriorating and that risks to the CPEC included, quote, Pakistani politics, such as competing parties, religion, tribes, terrorists, and Western intervention, the CPEC not only relies on dedicated Pakistani military force of 10,000 people to protect the assets that are being created under the CPEC, but it would also create a sophisticated system of monitoring and surveillance involving real-time monitoring and 24-hour video recording, explosion detectors, and scanners covering Pakistani cities, roads, and crowded areas. Already, the Chinese have sent the CPEC, the CPEC will also include a national fiber optic network, which, in addition to supporting internet traffic, will be used, according to the report, for the dissemination of Chinese culture in order to enhance the, quote, traditional friendship between the two countries. The CPEC also has important security implications. As part of the CPEC, the Chinese have made its Beidou satellite navigation system available to the Pakistani military. Beidou can be used for more precise guidance for missiles, ships, and aircraft, as well as a range of civilian uses. Beijing intends Beidou to replace the American military's GPS network. Just as the Chinese fear that the US GPS is monitored and manipulated by the United States, so too Beidou can be monitored by China. The Chinese hope that their provision of Beidou to Pakistan will serve as a model that will attract other BRI countries away from using the American system. While the Pakistani government has until recently been swayed by the immense benefits promised by the CPEC, the program has aroused controversy from significant quarters. As early as October 2016, the Pakistani senator who serves as chairman of the Senate Standing Committee on Planning and Development warned, and I quote, "Another East India company is in the offing. National interests are not being protected," end of quote. He goes on to say the CPEC could become another East India company. That's a real condemnation in the South Asian context. Opposition is particularly strong in the resource-abundant but sparsely populated province of Baluchistan, where the CPEC will extract resources, attract immigrants, but bring limited economic benefits to the native Baluchis. All right. This conspiratorial plan declared Jander Baluch, a spokesperson for the Baluch Liberation Army, is not acceptable to the Baluch people under any circumstances. The Baluch Liberation Army has recently claimed responsibility for the suicide bombers attack on a bus carrying Chinese engineers in Baluchistan's Chughi district in August of 2018, and also an attack on the Chinese consulate in Karachi in November 2018. Yeah, okay. All right, let me just finish. 2 minutes? Yeah, okay. Let me then just finish by moving to my conclusions. It's clear that the Pakistanis are reevaluating, and let me just conclude by talking briefly about, to say that India has offered some alternatives to the BRI, but they are woefully underfunded. And simply don't hold up in comparison to the benefits offered by China. Even when India, as is the case with the Asian African growth corridors, tried to team up with other countries, in this case China. Second, I think, consequence is that it's very clear that, at least within South Asia, the BRI has, in essence, created a more equitable political economy, in the sense that India has been the regional sort of dominating country, and it's ignored its neighbors. With the BRI, its neighbors have options, and therefore they have much more power relative to India. Finally, I've emphasized a particular aspect of the experiences that we find in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan. But even in Pakistan, a single country, we show there's an evolution in the relationship between Pakistan and China through the BRI. I'm very confident that if we looked at all the countries that are involved with the BRI, we would find a range of experiences. And so, in conclusion, I think it provides a really interesting opportunity to examine which countries do better under the BRI and which countries do worse, and what are the factors that contribute to positive outcomes as opposed to negative outcomes. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So we're actually at the time. Just go for a couple of very short minutes. I have one quick comment from the two papers, maybe one question for each participant, and then we break for coffee. So each paper is looking at reactions to the BRI. In the case of Sean's paper, it was non-governmental social actors. How important they are, their connection to social movements remains to be determined, but there definitely is something taking place that goes beyond the sheer technical and logistical arrangements that are involved. In John's case, it has to do with broader issues concerning balance of power questions, actually, here. And the question that occurred to me is, you know, as the United States withdraws from Afghanistan, which it certainly will within the next 4 to 5 years, I believe, it becomes much less dependent, if at all, on Pakistan. And now, what you have here, if China and the United States can't find a way for a more stable framework for their relationship in the long-term future, we see a very classic case for the expansion of the field of balance of power politics, right? That is to say, with the United States and India aligning more closely, right, against a Chinese-Pakistani orientation, which could be reinforced by ideological dimensions, right, because of the largest democracy in the world, the oldest democracy allegedly in the world, and so forth. Just keep this in mind. In 10 years ago, there were 0 U.S. military sales to India. Now, they're about $15 billion a year. And they include transport and maritime patrol aircraft, anti-ship missiles, helicopters. In 2016, not under the Trump administration, under the Obama administration, the United States formally declared India to be a, quote, major defense partner. That opens more systems for sale, drone and fighter aircraft, aircraft carrier technologies, and so forth. So I think it's also a cautionary note because what we can see here goes beyond the bilateral issues that are involved, and it actually can be a field for a further extension of the Chinese-American competition, containment, what have you, by applying very, very simple balance of power logic. All right, so one question for each speaker, and then we break. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed these two presentations. And I now have a better understanding of the local reactions to the Chinese activities in Central and South Asia. My question has to do with the social and political reactions to China. To what extent is it different from local reactions to the West, the practice of the West? So, for instance, creditor imperialism isn't the invention of China. I mean, if you look at the World Bank and IMF, they also use the loans, concessional loans, to create structural adjustments that basically destroyed state capacity and the welfare regimes of many of these developing countries. And Djibouti is not the place where China has a military presence. US also has a military base there. So what are the reactions of these countries to the West, and how is it different from their reaction and kind of popular and also elite reaction to Chinese practices that are similar?
Do either of you wish to reply to that? Sure. John, go ahead.
Well, I think, thank you. The reactions to the West they're still, most people in these countries are highly critical of the West as well. And in fact, I think that... Switch. Okay. So they remain critical of Western countries and their arrangements. The one, I think, positive outcome is that they now have choices, and so they're in a better position to sort of bargain. At the same time, to hold China up to the standard of the United States and the West is, for some people, and I would say even some people in China, a rather disappointing standard, especially since people in China feel that they have a very different experience having gone through being dominated by the West. And some people might want China to try and do better. And I'm not saying China isn't doing better, but I think the West is not necessarily the best standard to hold up China to.
Although I will say your description of the terms of the Gawar port operation were remarkable. There are remarkable similarities to the Panama Canal Zone between 1903 and 1977. Any questions for Professor Lyons? Yes, Z, who is my student.
Thank you so much, Professor, two professors. And my question about the Central Asia is, Professor Lyons, you provide a really detailed story of a group of villagers waking up the next morning finding out their land gets stolen, not stolen, but getting taken away by the Chinese companies. So my question is, in what extent do you think Chinese companies use corruptions or other sorts of payments to smoothing their deal or influencing the politics of these countries?
One of the most common criticisms in these websites is the absence of transparency in these processes. The agreements between China and the various entities in Central Asia are not made public. I read of a Tajik parliament member who complained that, yes, we have this major new agreement, but we don't know the terms of the agreement. So corruption, uncertainty, the lack of transparency all create this uncertainty and apprehension and suspicion.